Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today you get a 2-in-1 for my TBR shelf series. I started one of my nonfiction reads for the year, which is this biography of Abigail Adams called Dearest Friend by Lynne Withey. It shouldn't come as a shocker to anyone given my previous disclaimers that nonfiction takes me a while and often I need a bit of fiction motivation to get me through. So about, a third, maybe half of the way through Dearest Friend, I picked up this fantasy novella called Sightwitch and also read this. So I'm going to talk about both books in today's video. You're also getting me after I have finished both of them. I know I typically like to film my reactions to the book as I'm reading through them. This time I ended up starting both books telling myself, oh, you need to stop and you need to film something. I just never got around to doing it and ended up getting far enough into Dearest Friend and reading Sightwitch in, 2 sittings, and by that point I was like, okay, I'll just film a wrap-up video, like a proper review of both of these at the same time. Maybe this video might actually be a little bit shorter than some of my other TBR shelf reviews are. I'm not promising anything though. Starting with the biography, I will say up front I gave this book only 2 stars on Goodreads. I don't have anything against the author or her writing style or the level of research that I think went into this book. Honestly, I just could not stand the subject, Abigail Adams. I think I've mentioned before that David McCullough's John Adams biography was one of my first forays into the genre outside of school-assigned reading. Despite the tome-like length of that biography, I genuinely fell in love with the story and learning about the man and his life and what he contributed and why he's remembered in American history. And so I thought I would enjoy learning about his wife and learning about Abigail Adams, the woman behind so much of what John was able to accomplish during his span on Earth. Unfortunately, I've never experienced a book that made me more disappointed to be an American, which may or may not be an extreme statement depending on who you are. I understand nobody is perfect, but the sheer amount of selfishness, narrow-mindedness, and self-victimization that happened in this biography and that is exhibited by Abigail and John Adams throughout their lives, and 90% of this book was absolutely infuriating. In the beginning of the book, I thought my complaints were pretty minimal. I enjoyed some of the initial conversations around parenting and women's place in society, given Abigail Adams' position as kind of a forebearer of feminism and a woman who, within the confines of her society, spoke out for female representation. I was intrigued by conversations around how she was raised and what people thought about child rearing and domesticity during her formative years. It wasn't shocking to me in some respects that things haven't changed a lot from the 1700s to the 2000s. Women throughout history have had to hold this place of being the morality police, and the purpose of their education, particularly in Abigail's time frame, is all about making women better wives, mothers, and homemakers. It is not about them being able to contribute to society like men do and having places outside of the home and careers outside of the home and individual thoughts and ideas and ambitions. It is all centered around educating women to be better able to manage a household, aka take things off of men's plate that they don't want to deal with. that's at least very much how this book turned out in terms of like how Abigail went throughout her life and the nature of her relationship with John Adams. I found it pretty compelling how Lynne Withey explains the cycle of opinions on marriage, childbearing, and gendered responsibilities, and she talks about how they kind of shift generation by generation. And so even between Abigail and her parents and then Abigail's children, we see these fluctuations in what society deems as important in these domains, and some of the disagreements that arise because of how people think about marriage differently and prioritize things differently. We left all of those conversations far too quickly, and the biography of Abigail Adams quickly became her life story as a veneer for talking about John Adams' career. The author tries to position this in terms of Abigail always having this ambition and drive beyond her, societal, her accepted role as a female in society. Given those constraints of her time, she has to settle for living vicariously through her husband, which is all fine and dandy. Like, there's 100% truth to that. But I really wanted to know in the biography how Abigail actually spent her days and spent her time. I wanted it to actually just be about her, which I don't think is too much to ask when you're talking about the biography centering on Abigail Adams. I didn't understand why we didn't spend more time in her day-to-day experience, managing a farm, raising a family, just making ends meet during the Revolutionary War, these hardships that she faced on a daily basis. Like, I didn't know what her week looked like. Like, what did she wake up and do on Monday? I don't know. I couldn't tell you because it is glazed over at such a high level, focusing on really her story through her letters to other men and women in her life, and not about her actual experiences in the moment, if that makes sense. For most of the Revolutionary War, what we're getting is a high-level perusal of John's activities and how they impacted Abigail, not necessarily Abigail's experiences. There's this constant cycle of John being appointed to some sort of public office and him forcing Abigail to decide on whether he should accept this position. But everyone really knows that she doesn't have a choice because John's going to say yes to it no matter what, because he wants to have this political career and be a household name. But he kind of forces the decision on Abigail so that when she gets upset and lonely because he's gone for a very significant portion of their early years of marriage, leaving her alone to raise young children and manage a farm, he can point at her and be like, well, you said I could accept this position. It's a really grating cycle, and one or two times would be fine, but this was every single time that some sort of opportunity came up for John. This cycle repeated. Abigail had to always carry the burden of choosing between her family and the public good, or the country, if you will, while John just gets the fun of playing this big important man, neglecting all of his responsibilities as a husband and a father. Pardon the outfit change. I'm filming this over a couple days for the sake of time, so there may be a bit of back and forth between video clips. I did want to provide a few examples from the book of how Abigail is portrayed as this very selfish, self-righteous person. We have a segment on page 126 which takes place over the course of the Revolutionary War, and Benedict Arnold the news has come that he has betrayed the American army to the British. And when Abigail learns of this, she gets very indignant, not particularly because of its impact on Americans being able to win the war against Britain, but because of how she thinks Arnold's actions reflect on Americans, particularly people who are less religious than her. And in her writings that are quoted here, it's stated she attributes Arnold's treason to a lack of religious principles. And Lynne Withey says this was not mere rationalization on Abigail's part, for she believed absolutely that religious principles and moral behavior were inseparable. She also believed that there were too many Americans like Arnold, although perhaps not quite so depraved as he, and that their behavior was responsible for American failures in the war. Unprincipled wretches, as she called them, sapped the virtue of the American people, drew the wrath of God, and stood in the way of victory. I wouldn't be shocked if you notice as I read some of these excerpts how some of the phrasing and beliefs don't look all that different from what people on the right have to say and individuals in our current administration have to say about how a country should be run and how a people should behave. Okay, another piece I wanted to talk about is around that cycle of John agreeing to an appointment because he thinks it's what's best for him, not what is best for his family or for Abigail. Like, that doesn't even factor into his thought process at many points. And so at this point, he is already in Europe. He's been there for a while. I think he ends up being separated from Abigail for about 4.5, 5 years. And she gets very depressed, reasonably so, during this time. And because of the way communication was handled, and it was letters, and it was passing on ships, and it was wartime, like, it was very infrequent communication. Abigail was feeling extremely lonely, extremely overworked, and extremely underappreciated from her husband. And then we get this back and forth of John saying, Abigail, come live with me in Europe because I'm going to be here for a while. But then don't come because I think I might come home soon. And then now come. And Abigail's like, I want to come, but also I don't want to travel across the ocean because that sounds really hard and terrible, and I don't want to leave my home. I want you to come home. And they passed letters back and forth for, I don't know, it felt like 10 years, but I think it was only maybe a year and a half that they were really having this conversation. And we have a point here where it says, Abigail had been willing to set aside her fears and brave the trip to Europe to join him during the war, at a time when his services seemed desperately needed. But now, she thought, it was time to set all that aside and pick up the threads of their shattered life. Deep in her heart, however, she knew that no amount of argument about the need for his services at home would keep John from staying in Europe. And she began to wonder if indeed he did not love politics better than he loved her. I know not whether I shall believe myself, how well you love me, she told him, unless I can prevail upon you to return in the spring. It was not that she wanted him out of politics altogether. She knew that was impossible, despite John's periodic resolutions to return to private life. But she wanted him to continue his political career at home. I have no reason to think that my friend would be permitted to retire from public life, whilst his active powers can be of any service to his country. A state of inactivity was never meant for man. And this goes on for quite a while, of Abigail knowing full well that her husband is never going to put her first and put the children first. It is his career, or he will be unhappy, and everyone will feel that. And so she is left to fight this battle of, sacrificing her wants and her desires for a life that she envisioned for herself with this career that, in some ways she's interested in but can't pursue because she's a woman in her time. And so she has moments where she enjoys living vicariously through John to achieve that, but then she's the one who's also not receiving any of the benefits of that, right? Her position has put her receiving all of the hardships of that type of lifestyle. It just kind of sucks for her. When Abigail finally does move to Europe to be with John for a while, and then the Revolutionary War ends at this point in time, and John ends up being the first ambassador to Great Britain for the new United States, Abigail has a coffee.
Hugo.
Thank you.
You want it here? There?
That's fine. You can leave it there. It's not like I'm going to drink it right now.
Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt your recording twice.
You're okay. I love you.
I love you too. Have fun. Mwah.
Mwah.
Say smart things.
I don't know how much smart things I'll say, but I'll try.
All the smart things.
All the smart things. Okay. Okay, so Abigail is finally in Europe with John, and she has quite a few opinions on the Europeans. She has already gone with preconceptions about them because growing up in America and experiencing the Revolutionary War, she has this idea of Europeans as being part of old, outdated means of living or very immoral ways of living. They don't do things correctly, essentially, and she comes with those preconceived notions. And so when she's in France and when she's in London and she's visiting surrounding areas, she is very demeaning towards Europeans of any color and is extremely judgmental of how they choose to spend their time, how they choose to spend their money, their religious practices, their social practices and customs, what they believe, how their government works, how they eat. And it is extremely frustrating to read as very clear evidence of Abigail's narrow-mindedness, and she holds so firmly to one way of thinking and that her way of living is the only correct way of living and is unable to appreciate anybody else's differences, ends up, very much, in my mind, in my opinion, wasting her time in Europe. Yes, she goes to operas and she goes to bathing houses and she goes to plays and museums and stuff, and she gets to experience things that most people in her time period would never have gotten to experience. She just can't appreciate any of it, and when she does appreciate it, she has to slap her own wrist for appreciating it and for giving into the dissipation and the immorality of enjoying entertainment and enjoying arts and amusing things in her life. It's just very uncomfortable to read in how prejudiced she is. And we have a paragraph that I think kind of captures this. Abigail's preference for her lowly cottage was part of her unshakable belief that America was superior to Europe, a superiority based on its simplicity, its supposed lack of extreme wealth and class distinctions, its religion, and its emphasis on family. She had come to Europe convinced that she would not be taken in by its splendors, and she interpreted everything she saw in light of her rigidly fixed taste. The simple cottage in Braintree became a metaphor for the superiority of American life. Throughout their whole time in Europe, Abigail is also managing their farm and property back home, and her children's education back home, and their financial situation back home. It's a lot to manage being overseas, and John just doesn't care. Abigail tries to include him in these affairs and just ends up having no luck, which, is a theme that frequently appears where Abigail will take on a responsibility for a job that she sees needs done, and John is happily willing to hand it off to her because she's good at it. AKA, John is not interested and doesn't want to be bothered. He is very much incapable of being an adult sometimes. At least that's how he comes across in this book. Chapters 12 and 13 are when Abigail and John end up going back to America, and he is elected as vice president with George Washington as president. And I don't have any particular quotes to read from this section, but I did generally have frustrations with these couple of chapters because we have several more examples of John's just complete inability to help his wife with anything. We also have very consistent examples of Abigail's inability to empathize with anyone and to be able to step out of her own viewpoint. She's extremely hypocritical and unable to acknowledge her own privilege in life. There is a point at which there's a rebellion that happens amongst some farmers in America because the economic situation is just awful after the war. Nobody can get paid, nobody can pay debts, nobody can pay taxes, and inflation is terrible. And so you have these farmers rise up to kind of try to close the courts for a time period to be like, you have to stop demanding money of us that we can't pay and taking away our livelihoods when we can't pay. Like, what are we supposed to do here? And Abigail's response to this is not to acknowledge any of the situational circumstances that are happening, but she attributes the farmers' actions to them being morally bankrupt. Like, they weren't good enough Christians, they weren't good, like, pious enough people, and that's why they're facing the hardships that they face. And if America was just a more upright country and more frugal and more patriotic or whatever, like, we wouldn't be in these situations, which is just extremely flawed logic to have, but that is how she approaches it. And she goes from being a champion of the Revolutionary War to immediately being like, hey, we fought the fight, we're done. Nobody can rebel, nobody can question anything, nobody can fight for any more rights because we've been there, done that, and now you just need to be good little obedient citizens. It's particularly hypocritical for Abigail because she has been in a position that even when she has had to scrape to make ends meet, she's never been in want of anything, and so she's unable to appreciate the suffering of others and the poverty that others around her are experiencing. This contributes to a very extreme political conservatism on her part. She and John both are extremely prejudiced against anyone who is not truly American or morally righteous and in agreement with some of their political viewpoints which heavily align with European monarchy at the time. Abigail just sees the whole world as black and white. There is no room for gray in her viewpoint. At this point in the book, which, if you can tell, let's see, so I don't know, 2/3 of the way through the book, the author finally does start calling out Abigail's narrow-mindedness and saying, you know, acknowledging the fact that Abigail and John both have moved into this very conservative, very prejudiced place in their political opinions. Chapter 14 is when John is elected as president. There were a few points in here where I just genuinely wanted to tear my hair out because John was so self-victimizing. We get another very long period of John being like, I'm not appreciated. I've done so much for this country and sacrificed so much. I deserve to be president. But also, I will never say that I want to be president because I am a good man and a religious man and I'm not ambitious at all. Like, I'll retire if that's what needs to happen, but also I'm going to be extremely bitter and hold grudges if I don't become president. And Abigail just stokes this fire. Like, she just loves to stroke her husband's ego, and I wanted to strangle something, both of them preferably, but at bare minimum I wanted to throw this book across the wall quite a few times. Chapter 15 gives us a few more examples of John's weaponized incompetence. I was very much feeling that the 1790s were not all that different from the 2020s. There is a period of time when John has finally been elected as the second president of the United States and ends up passing these laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts, which are a series of laws that permitted the arrest of newspaper editors for publishing seditious statements against the government, increased the naturalization period for foreigners from 5 to 14 years, and allowed the deportation of aliens accused of seditious acts. And Abigail thinks that these acts are not strong enough. At this point in her life, she is prone to conspiracy theories and is immediately prejudiced against anyone who lives slightly different from her, looks different from her, has different political beliefs from her. She thinks anyone opposed to her is like trying to destroy the new American government and trying to get America back into being a British colony, that everyone's out to get her and John and to just slander their names. She is very much against free speech at this point. She wants like every single newspaper shut down unless they say nice things about her and her husband, and is just like punishments for other people for having opinions, even though she thinks that none of her opinions can be wrong. Thankfully, these particular Alien and Sedition Acts went into effect in, 1798 or something? And by, 1801, they had either lapsed or repealed. So they didn't last very long. I think by the time John was no longer president, or by, Thomas Jefferson's presidency, they were already gone and done with. Not to say we don't have abysmal immigration and free speech laws on the books today. I have a couple final sections to read. One is when John is not elected to his second term as president, and Abigail throws her whole tantrum of, we have sacrificed so much, we deserve this, John deserved this, the American public is so ungrateful. She has all of these arguments for it, and the one that just particularly irked me is she even managed to argue that John's financial problems would have a more serious negative effect on the public than on themselves. We will live in independence because we will live within our income, she asserted. If that is mean and much below the rank we ought to move in, the fault is not ours. The country which called into service an active, able, and meritorious citizen at advanced years can dismiss him to retirement and poverty in the world's sense. That country must bear the disgrace. Apparently, she believed that a country's honor demanded that its ex-presidents live in style, but she failed to see that the vast majority of Americans would have laughed to be told that John Adams would go home to Quincy to live in poverty. Because the entire time that John has been president, despite the fact that they complain ad nauseum about how little John was paid, they have managed to save the entire time. They have bought property. They have renovated their house multiple times. They are living the high life at this point in American history. They are in the upper echelons of society, and yet Abigail fails time and time again to recognize that privilege and just to be content and be happy with what they have been able to achieve in life. The last part that I wanted to talk about and maybe read here is their oldest son, John Quincy, marries a woman named Louisa, and when she meets John and Abigail, they never quite get along. Abigail, I think, largely contributes to the fact that they don't have a great relationship and can't communicate very well to each other, because Louisa is just not the type of person and type of woman that Abigail thinks that a wife and a mother should be, and is very hard on Louisa for that. Louisa's very shy and, has this desire to please her mother-in-law, but as a very shy, anxious person, the more she tries, the more she fails and comes across as very awkward and very reserved and just incompetent to Abigail. Abigail, at this point in John's retirement, has tried her best to become the matriarch of her family and bring all of her kids and their wives and their children into her house and have this little compound, and is extremely domineering. And there was a point in this book where I was like, what? You think this woman was an early feminist? Some of the things that she says about women that she does not approve of are just frankly egregious and downright nasty. Louisa is pregnant with her second baby, and the book reads, she had a history of miscarriages. and her first delivery had been a difficult one, so she and John Quincy were both nervous about her condition. Abigail commented to Thomas, one of her other sons, a bit testily that John Quincy hadn't been out to visit in 2 weeks, spending every moment fretting over Louisa. He looks as anxious as though he had the trouble himself to pass through, she wrote, and added that a man choosing a wife ought to look for one with a strong constitution. I just couldn't after that. I was like, you have this woman who is going through childbirth in a time in which that was extremely scary for women, and has a history of miscarriages and of difficult pregnancies, and wants the bare minimum from her husband, which is to be with her during her pregnancy. And her husband's mother is like, my son should visit me more often. John Quincy, if you wanted to have kids, you should have chosen a wife who was a better broodmare. Like, yeah, I was infuriated, to say the least. I still am. Every time I read that, I'm just like, it makes me so angry that I almost want to cry at how women can be so, like, can have the misogyny so ingrained in them that they think and they treat and they talk of other women in their lives in this way. Like, I believe so much that women are only capable of being mothers, and if you can't even do that correctly, well, you don't deserve to have your husband comfort you and be with you. That's what I have to say, is just grunt. To wrap this up, I'm going to read the last portion of the review that I wrote, just to keep myself from rambling on and on and on about this book. The author tries to give Abigail a redemption arc in the final chapter. She gets softer, more tolerant, distances herself from politics. She reconciles with friends and has moved on. However, Abigail continues to espouse the same harmful beliefs and propensity to jump to conclusions and conspiracy theories when it comes to her children, particularly with John Quincy's political career. She's domineering with her children and grandchildren. She doesn't take no for an answer, and she never apologizes for her behavior. At least, none of that happens as divulged by the author. In the end, I found the book exhausting to get through and lost any ounce of appreciation I had for Abigail Adams. Some may say she was merely a woman of her time, but the honest truth is that I know far too many women just like her in my own life. People who refuse to see forgiveness, learn from their mistakes, and fight for the life, liberty, and justice of others. And those are not people I admire or want to be associated with. Overall, I think Abigail suffers from being frightfully provincial and downright boring. She marries young, spends most of her life birthing and raising children, runs a farm, and writes letters. Abigail lives completely in the shadow of her husband, so a biography that centers on her feels like a mediocre biography of John Adams. As I've been writing this review, I also have to retract some of my previous statements about not having anything against the author's style. Lynne Withey 100% utilizes Abigail Adams to send a specific message, and she does so in an extremely repetitive manner. As one Goodreads reviewer expresses it, I don't think she could have mentioned more frequently that 1. Abigail Adams lived vicariously through her husband's political life. 2. Our heroine was willing to sacrifice her own happiness out of a sense of patriotic duty. And 3. That Abigail's belief in the education of women was contradicted by her traditional view that a woman's place was in the home, to the exclusion of all else. If I had to read one more chapter of this book, I might seriously have jumped out of window. Hence, why it is only getting 2 stars from me. If you like books that make you want to pull out your hair, maybe give this a go. If you like books, on the other hand, that make you actually enjoy your time reading them, I would say take a look at Sightwitch. So during a point in which I was heavily considering dropping this biography, I decided to take a pause and pick up a piece of fiction so that I could have something that was actually fun and enjoyable to read, and then go back to the slog that was Dearest Friend. I picked up Sightwitch, which I didn't realize at the time is actually a side story in the Witchlands series by Susan Dennard. According to Goodreads, this book takes place a year before Truthwitch, which I think is book 1 in the series. Despite having pretty much zero context for the world, I very quickly fell in love with this story and with the two main characters we're introduced to. Ryber is our female character and Colin is our male character. The other interesting thing about this book is that it's an illustrated novel. So let me show you. It's written as diary entries from different perspectives, and then we have insertions of like school assignments and letters between people, essays that the girls write, diary entries. We get actual illustrations. I'm trying to find, there's like, yeah, here we go. There's like maps that happen. It's very interesting. Here you go. So it's a very interesting book to read, and the visuals are definitely helpful. It was initially confusing to me to kind of hop between all the different pieces, but once you get used to that style, it is actually very interesting to have the visual companions to what's going on. Mostly because I think her writing style tends to lean away from very descriptive text, and so she ends up describing something in very sparse language, and then the visual actually helps you understand what's happening. The story itself follows two timelines. We have Ryber in the present day, and then we have Eurydice, who is 1,000 years in the past. Both of them are part of the Sightwitches, who are a group of women living in a convent and blessed with magical abilities from their goddess Surmaya, I think is how you say it. We pick up the story when Ryber is now age 17. She's been at the convent as a serving sister for 13 years and has been waiting a very long time to be summoned by Surmaya into the mountain to become a full-fledged Sightwitch. Her best friend, Tansy, gets summoned within the first few pages, and things quickly become really weird and then go downhill like super fast. So within the span of like 3 weeks, Ryber ends up being the only sister left at this convent and struggling to figure out what's going on. Why has her goddess done this very abnormal behavior? What's happening? Is she dying? What's going on in the world? What follows is this really riveting tale of Ryber journeying into this mountain, a place where she's not supposed to go alone, and a place where she, as just a serving sister, shouldn't even be until she has been properly summoned. And so, but she is desperate to save her sisters, and so she's willing to put her life on the line to make this happen. While she's in the mountain, she meets this young captain, Colin Ilcray? Colin Icray? I don't know how you say his name. He has no idea who he is. He doesn't know how he's ended up in this mountain. They end up discovering that he is a different type of magical bearer, which I'm assuming is pertinent to the main series. It doesn't necessarily impact the plot of this book, is what I'll say, without trying to give too many spoilers away. But Colin joins Ryber in her attempts to rescue her family, her sisters, and we get this back and forth between Ryber's timeline, Eurydice's timeline, and find out that what's going on in present day has been like prophesied and prepared for well in advance. I don't want to spoil too much because I think this book is definitely worth the read, whether you've read the main series and want to like continue in the world, or just kind of want something that could be a standalone to the Witchlands or even an introduction to the Witchlands. I will note, because this is a companion novella, I think more than likely the characters that I fell in love with in this book are either non-existent or just side characters in the main series, which does make me a little less interested in picking up the other 4 or 5 books that are in the Witchlands. I think maybe at some point I will read them because I did like the world. I liked Susan Dennard's writing style, and I think she probably has some other characters that I would end up enjoying. But for now, I probably won't. But I'm not racing to pick them up because I know I won't get to learn much more. I won't get to live in Ryber's perspective and her relationship dynamic with Colin won't exist. All in all, though, this one is definitely, I think 4 stars is what I gave it, and it was 100% a welcome break from the life of Abigail Adams. If any of you have read the main series of the Witchlands, I would love to know down in the comments below what you thought of them, and if you would recommend that I pick them up at some point post my TBR shelf read, because I was interested enough in this world, I really liked the characters, and I would be interested at some point probably picking up the Witchlands series when I have some time. But with that, if you liked this video, I hope that you subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one.